I thought Daniel was refinancing our mortgage. He was refinancing my mother's cabin, the one thing she left me, using a signature that wasn't mine. I found the document by accident, the way you find out about a tumor by accident, reaching for something else entirely. But before I tell you about the drawer, and the paper, and the way my own name looked like a stranger's handwriting staring back at me, I have to tell you how ordinary everything was, because that's the part nobody believes afterward. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights, not the betrayal itself, but how *normal* the morning of it had been. It started 3 years earlier, on a Tuesday that smelled like burnt toast and coffee grounds. Our kitchen in those days was small and yellow-tiled, the kind of kitchen that came with the house instead of being chosen by us. And every morning, Daniel stood at the counter in his undershirt scraping black crumbs off 2 pieces of bread while I measured coffee by eye because I never trusted the little scoop that came with the machine. He always burned the toast. 8 years of marriage, and the man could restructure a corporate balance sheet in his sleep, but couldn't operate a toaster without setting off the smoke detector. "You're doing it again?" I told him, nodding at the dial. "Doing what?" 4. Every time you put it on 4, it burns. 3.5. "There's no 3.5, Sarah. It's a dial, nada." He stopped himself, smiled, kissed the top of my head on his way to the sink. "Fine, 3.5. I'll write it on the fridge." He didn't write it on the fridge. He never did. But he also never really burned it that badly again for a while, and I remember thinking, with the small, stupid satisfaction of a woman who believes her marriage is a solved equation, that this was what 8 years bought you. Not fireworks. Just a man who adjusted a dial because you asked him to. My sister Vanessa called most mornings around 8, while Daniel was still in the shower, and most mornings I let it go to voicemail because Vanessa's calls at 8 a.m. were rarely about anything except money, and I didn't have the stomach for money conversations before coffee. She was older than me by 4 years, prettier in the way that made strangers assume she was the successful one, and perpetually 3 steps behind on rent for a boutique she ran that never quite broke even. Our mother used to say Vanessa collected debts the way other people collected shoes, compulsively, and without much thought for where she'd put them all. Mom had been gone 2 years by then. Pancreatic cancer, fast the way it usually is. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral home parking lot, where Vanessa and I stood in the cold, not talking to each other, because neither of us knew what a person was supposed to say. Mom left the house in town to Vanessa, since Vanessa had nowhere else to go, and she left me the cabin. The cabin wasn't worth much on paper. 2 bedrooms, cedar siding gone silver with age, a dock that needed new boards every spring, 40 minutes past the last gas station on Route 9. But it was the only place I'd ever been unconditionally happy, and my mother had known that when she wrote the will, and so she'd left it to me with a note clipped to the deed that said, in her small slanted handwriting, * for the only one of my daughters who ever actually wanted to be there. * I kept the key on a plain brass ring, no fob, no decoration, and it lived in the dish by our front door for 2 years, mostly unused, because life had a way of eating the summers before you could get up there. Daniel liked the cabin fine. He liked it the way you like a photograph of a place, pleasant to look at, no particular urge to go. That should have told me something. It didn't, not then. The first strange thing happened in October, 11 months before I found the drawer, and it was so small that I filed it under *nothing* for almost a year. Daniel had started closing his laptop when I walked into the room. Not slamming it, Daniel never slammed anything. He was too controlled a man for that, just a smooth, unhurried closing, the way you'd close a book you'd finished reading. I noticed it the way you notice a picture hung slightly crooked, not alarming, just slightly off. "Work stuff," he said when I asked, not looking up from his phone. "Clients being difficult about the merger paperwork. You don't want the details, trust me." I didn't want the details. That was true. I trusted him, and trusting him meant not asking twice, and for 11 months I lived inside that trust the way you live inside a house whose foundation you've never once thought to inspect. Vanessa started calling him directly around Christmas. Not me, him. I found out only because his phone lit up on the kitchen counter one evening while he was in the shower, her name glowing white on the black screen, and when he came out I mentioned it, casual, the way you mention weather. "Vanessa called you. Did she?" He towel-dried his hair, not meeting my eyes in the mirror. "Probably wanted advice on the shop's books. She asks me sometimes. I used to do that stuff for a living, remember?" It made sense. It made so much sense that I didn't think about it again until February, when I picked up his phone to check the time. Mine was dead. charging in the other room, and saw a text thread with her that scrolled up further than a bookkeeping conversation should ever need to scroll. I didn't read it. I told myself I didn't read it because I trusted him, but the truth, the uglier truth, is that some cowardly animal part of me didn't want to know yet. I put the phone back down exactly where it had been, screen dark, and went and sat on the edge of the bathtub with my heart doing something strange and irregular in my chest. And I told myself, asterisk, you're imagining things. You're tired. Don't be that woman. Asterisk, there's a moment I've replayed more than any other from that whole year, and it's this one, sitting on the cold edge of the tub, deciding on purpose not to know something, because knowing would have cost me a version of my life I still wanted to believe in. Asterisk, that was the moment I should have understood everything. I didn't. Not yet. Asterisk, I found the drawer in September, on a Saturday when Daniel had gone golfing with men from his office, and I was looking for the stapler. Our home office was really just a converted closet with a desk crammed into it, and Daniel kept a locked drawer at the bottom that he called boring stuff. Whenever I asked, insurance forms, tax documents, the kind of paperwork that makes marriages function without either party having to think about it. I'd never needed to open it. That Saturday, I needed the stapler, and the stapler, for reasons I still don't fully understand, was apparently in that drawer because Daniel had mentioned once offhand that he kept office supplies down there too. The drawer wasn't locked. That detail has stayed with me, how ordinary and unlocked it was, like it wasn't important enough to protect, like whatever was inside had stopped feeling dangerous to the person who put it there. My hand found the stapler first, cold metal under a folder. I pulled the folder out to move it aside, and that's when I saw my mother's handwriting on the tab. Not my mother's, exactly, a photocopy of it, the deed to the cabin. The one with her note still clipped in the corner, asterisk for the only one of my daughters who ever actually wanted to be there. Asterisk, seeing it there in Daniel's drawer didn't alarm me at first. It made sense that he'd have a copy. What alarmed me was the second document underneath it. A power of attorney. Real estate transactions. My name at the bottom, in handwriting that curved the way my asterisk S asterisk never curved. That dotted the asterisk I asterisk in a small circle, instead of a straight line the way I'd written since 4th grade, because a teacher told me circles were for people who wanted to be noticed, and I never wanted to be noticed. I stood there holding it for what felt like a very long time. The dust motes turning slow in the one shaft of window light, the refrigerator humming 2 rooms away. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started up and stopped again. I noticed all of this with a strange, hyper-alert clarity, the way you notice everything in the second before a car accident, because some animal part of my brain had already understood what my conscious mind was still refusing to. Asterisk, my hand, when I turned the page, was steady. That was the strangest part. I thought it should be shaking. Asterisk, the document authorized the sale of the cabin. Full authorization, no restrictions, dated 4 months earlier. Notarized by someone named Gregory Aldis, whose stamp I had never seen and whose office, according to the address beneath his seal, was 2 towns over from ours. I had never met a Gregory Aldis in my life. I had certainly never sat in an office and signed my name in front of him while he watched, which is what a notary is supposed to witness, which is the entire point of a notary. I read it 3 times. Each time I hoped the words would rearrange themselves into something innocent, a draft, unsigned, a form he'd printed by mistake. They didn't rearrange. They sat there being exactly what they were. My throat had gone dry and thick, the way it does right before you're sick, and I remember swallowing hard against it and thinking, absurdly, asterisk, I need to sit down before I fall down, asterisk, and lowering myself onto the office chair with the folder still open in my lap like something that might bite me if I moved too fast. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect crying, and what I actually felt was something colder and more total, something that started in my stomach and spread outward until my fingertips went numb with it. Somewhere underneath the numbness, a single sentence kept repeating, small and flat, asterisk, he sold my mother. Asterisk, not the cabin, my mother. That's what it felt like, holding that page. Like he had reached into the one drawer of my life I'd marked asterisk, do not touch asterisk, and touched it anyway, and signed her name, my name, which was also somehow hers, since she'd given it to me along with the house, to a piece of paper that made her last gift disappear. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself it was strategy. It was mostly fear. I photographed every page on my phone with hands that had finally, belatedly, started to shake, put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, corner turned down at the same angle, and went and sat on the porch steps until his headlights turned into the driveway at 6:40, smelling faintly of beer and sunscreen, in a good mood from a round of golf he'd apparently shot well. "Hey," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "You look pale, you feeling okay?" "Fine," I said. "Long day." I want to tell you I confronted him right there on the porch. I didn't. I smiled and I made dinner and I lay next to him that night listening to him breathe, running the numbers in my head over and over, trying to find an innocent explanation that fit the facts. There wasn't one. There never is once you start looking honestly. I called Vanessa 2 days later, not because I trusted her more than Daniel. I trusted her less, if anything, in some instinctive sisterly way I'd never examined, but because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't his, and because some part of me, some part that still wanted the whole thing to be a misunderstanding, hoped she'd tell me something that made it all make sense. "Have you talked to Daniel about the cabin lately?" I asked her, keeping my voice light, testing. There was a pause on the line, just half a second too long. "Why would I talk to Daniel about the cabin?" she said, too fast, too flat. "No reason, just he mentioned you two had been in touch about money stuff. We talk sometimes, he's good with numbers, you know that." "Right," I said. "Of course." That pause, that half second before she answered. I've thought about it more than almost anything else that happened afterward, because in that half second, I think some part of me already knew that my sister and my husband were not two separate betrayals. They were the same one, wearing two faces. The second discovery came 10 days later, and it came from Daniel himself, which was almost worse than finding it on my own, because it meant he decided the time had come to tell me a version of the truth on his own terms. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where he burned toast every morning at a dial setting of 4, with a manila folder of his own, thicker than the one in the drawer, and a face arranged into an expression I recognized from every difficult conversation we'd ever had. The calm, reasonable, let's be adults about this face. "I want to talk to you about the cabin," he said. "Before you hear it from someone else and get the wrong idea." My stomach dropped through the floor, but I kept my face still. "Okay. There's a mortgage on it, has been for about 8 months. I took it out to cover some, look, it's complicated, but essentially the business hit a rough patch last year. Cash flow stuff, and I needed collateral fast, and the cabin was sitting there basically doing nothing, and I figured, we're married, what's mine is yours, what's yours is, you forged my signature." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I saw the power of attorney, Daniel. I saw the notary stamp from a man I've never met." His face didn't crumble the way I'd imagined it would. In the version of this conversation I'd rehearsed alone in the car. It hardened instead, a small muscle working at his jaw, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen directed at me before, not guilt, but irritation. The look of a man annoyed that his solution had been discovered before it could finish solving itself. "I was going to tell you," he said. "Once the refinance cleared and things stabilized, I was going to sit you down and explain the whole picture. I didn't want to worry you over something I had completely under control." "Under control?" I laughed, and it came out uglier than I meant it to. "You forged legal documents. You had a stranger notarize my fake signature. That's not under control Daniel. That's a felony. Don't be dramatic. Don't be dramatic. 2 words. I would hear some version of those 2 words from him a dozen more times over the following weeks, every time the truth got too heavy for him to carry standing up. There's more," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice told me the floor was about to drop further than I'd braced for. "The buyer's already been found. It's Ray Kessler. You remember Ray from the office holiday party? He's offering under market, but it's a fast close, all cash, and given the mortgage situation, we honestly need the fast close more than we need top dollar." I said. "There is no who needs anything from that cabin. That cabin is mine. It's ours. We're married. I don't understand why you're acting like I robbed a stranger." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. Not a stranger, his wife, as if that made it smaller. The third layer came from Vanessa, and it came in a way I hadn't seen coming even after everything. I drove to her boutique the next afternoon, half-formed plan in my head to ask her, sister to sister, whether she'd known, hoping against every piece of evidence I already had that she'd say no and mean it. She was behind the counter, refolding sweaters that didn't need refolding, the nervous busy work of someone who'd clocked me walking through the door and needed her hands occupied. "Did you know," I said, no preamble, "that Daniel forged my signature to mortgage the cabin? That he's selling it to Ray Kessler for under market because he needs a fast close?" Vanessa's hands stopped moving. That was answer enough, but she gave me the words too eventually, in a voice gone small and defensive. "I knew about the mortgage," she said. I didn't know he forged anything, Sarah, I swear. But you knew about the mortgage. You knew he took a mortgage out on Mom's cabin without telling me, and you didn't say anything. It wasn't my place to. It wasn't your place. The word came out of me sharper than I intended, sharp enough that a customer near the door glanced up from a rack of scarves. I lowered my voice, but nothing about what I felt got quieter. "You're my sister. Mom left me that cabin specifically, Vanessa, specifically because she knew what it meant to me, and you sat on this for how long? How long have you known?" She looked at the floor. "Since the spring." Since the spring, 5 months. 5 months of Saturday phone calls and holiday dinners and 100 ordinary conversations where she could have told me and didn't because I understood this only later, when the last piece finally surfaced, because telling me would have meant admitting what she actually was to Daniel, which was not simply a sister who'd overheard some financial trouble. It was something else entirely. I found out what, 3 days after that, from a text message that arrived on Daniel's phone while it sat charging on our nightstand, and I, no longer the woman who put phones back down unread, picked it up and read every word. *Raise ready to close Friday. Can you get her to sign off by Thursday? I hate doing this behind her back, but we both know it's the only way. Miss you. Miss you. 2 words, small as a stone, and somehow heavier than every document in that folder combined. I read that message 4 times before I understood it wasn't a typo, wasn't a sisterly turn of phrase, wasn't anything except exactly what it looked like. My husband and my sister. Not just partners in a scheme to sell my mother's cabin out from under me, something else. Something that had apparently been going on, based on the ease of that sentence, for longer than 5 months. The room went very quiet around me. I remember the specific quality of that silence, not peaceful, but pressurized, like the air before a storm decides which direction to break. I sat down on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 8 years, and I did not throw the phone, did not scream, did not do any of the things I'd have expected of myself in that moment. I simply sat and breathed and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. The way a pond freezes over, not all at once, but from the edges inward, until the whole surface holds weight it never could have held before. My teeth found the inside of my cheek and bit down until I tasted copper, and I didn't even notice I'd done it until later in the bathroom mirror when I saw the small dark bruise blooming there like a bad secret. I didn't confront either of them that night. I did something I am, to this day, prouder of than almost anything else I've done in my adult life. I went completely, deliberately silent. For 2 weeks, I was the wife Daniel expected. I asked about his golf game. I let Vanessa's calls ring through to voicemail with the same easy indifference I'd always shown them, except now the indifference was a mask stretched carefully over something sharpening underneath it. I made dinner at 6. I laughed at the right places in conversation. And every night, once Daniel was asleep, I sat in the dark kitchen with my laptop and built, piece by piece, a case. I called my mother's old attorney first, a man named Frank Delgado who'd handled her estate and who'd known me since I was 9 years old, back when he used to come to the cabin on weekends with a fishing rod and a bag of the peppermints he always kept in his coat pocket. He answered on the second ring, and something in my voice must have told him this wasn't a social call, because he didn't ask how I was doing. He asked what happened. I told him everything. The drawer, the forged signature, the notary I'd never met, the mortgage, the affair. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and when he spoke again, his voice had a flatness to it I'd never heard from him before, the sound of a kind man deciding to be a useful one instead. "Sarah," he said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't confirm anything to either of them, and don't do anything, until I've had a forensic document examiner look at that signature. How long will that take? 10 days, maybe less if I push. Can you hold 10 days? I thought of my mother's handwriting on that deed, for the only one of my daughters who ever actually wanted to be there. I can hold 10 days, I told him. I can hold as long as I need to. Those 10 days changed something in me at the cellular level. I think I stopped sleeping much, but the sleeplessness had a strange clarity to it. 3 a.m. At the kitchen table, cold coffee going colder, a legal pad filling up with dates and names and dollar amounts, my hand steady in a way it had never been steady before. Because steadiness, I discovered, is not the absence of feeling. It's what's left after you've burned through every feeling that isn't useful. Frank called on day 8 with the forensic report. The signature on the power of attorney was not mine, not close, not a good forgery, according to the examiner, whose report used the phrase inconsistent pressure patterns inconsistent with the exemplar signatures provided, which was a very technical way of saying * your husband is not even good at crime. * Gregory Aldis, the notary, turned out not to hold an active commission in the state at all. His license had lapsed 14 months prior, which meant every document he'd stamped since then, including mine, was not just fraudulent but void from the start. "There's something else," Frank said before we hung up. "I did some digging into Ray Kessler, the supposed buyer. He's not paying market anything, Sarah. He's not really buying the cabin at all. The purchase agreement routes through an LLC registered to your husband's business partner. It's a wash sale. They were going to sell it to themselves, cheap, launder some cash flow problem through the transaction, and you'd have woken up one day with your mother's cabin gone and a paper trail clean enough that by the time you untangled it, the money would already be gone too." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after he finished talking, looking out the kitchen window at nothing in particular, and I felt the last soft part of me, the part that had wanted, right up until that moment, for there to be an innocent explanation, finally go quiet. "Frank," I said, "I want to be there when this comes apart, all of it. I don't want a quiet settlement. I want them standing in a room when they find out I know." He was silent for a second, and then, in a voice that sounded almost like pride, "Then let's build you that room." We built it around my father's 70th birthday. 3 weeks later, a dinner Vanessa had been planning for months. Guest list of 18, held at the same lake house restaurant where our parents had celebrated their own anniversary for 2 decades running. It was, I'll admit, a cruel place to choose for what I had planned. It was also exactly right. Daniel had no idea anything had changed. That was the strangest part of those 3 weeks, how completely he believed the woman across the breakfast table was still the same one who hadn't looked in that drawer. He complimented my dress that evening. He held my chair. He ordered wine for the table in the easy, expansive voice of a man who believes his problems are still safely contained. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes late, kissed our father's cheek, avoided my eyes with a skill I now understood came from months of practice. Frank arrived at 8:15, exactly when I'd asked him to, carrying a slim leather folder that he set, without comment, on the credenza near the door. I waited until the plates from the main course had been cleared, until my father had opened his gifts and made his small, self-deprecating jokes about turning 70, until the room had settled into that loose, wine-warmed hour where conversation drifts and nobody is watching anyone too closely. Then I stood up. "Before dessert," I said, and something in my voice, flat, clear, carrying, brought the table to silence faster than I expected. "I want to thank Daniel for something." Daniel looked up, smiling, uncertain, the smile of a man checking whether he's about to be complimented. "I want to thank him," I continued, "for teaching me how to read a power of attorney document. Because 4 months ago, he had one notarized with my signature on it, a signature I never wrote, authorizing him to mortgage and sell my mother's cabin. The cabin she left specifically to me, in her will, with a note." The smile drained off his face in real time, like watching color leave a photograph. "Sarah," he started, "I'm not finished." My voice didn't shake. "I want you to understand that because I had expected it to. The notary who stamped that document, Gregory Aldis, hasn't held a valid license in 14 months. The buyer, Ray Kessler, isn't actually buying anything. The sale routes through an LLC registered to Daniel's business partner, which a forensic examiner and my mother's attorney." I gestured to Frank, who inclined his head slightly, the leather folder still resting on the credenza like a held breath. "Have both confirmed is a wash sale designed to launder money through what would have been my mother's last gift to me." "This is insane," Daniel said, standing now, his voice climbing toward the register menus when they're losing an argument in front of witnesses. "You're airing private business in front of your entire family. This is a private financial matter between a husband and wife. You don't get to just, it stopped being private," I said, "the moment you forged my name on a legal document. And it stopped being just between a husband and wife the moment my sister started signing her text messages to you with * miss you. The silence that followed had a texture to it I will remember for the rest of my life. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, my Aunt Carol's hand flying to cover her own gasp, Vanessa's face going the color of old paper, and Daniel standing there with his mouth slightly open, looking, for the first time in 8 years of marriage, like a man who had run out of explanations. "Sarah," That's completely out of context," Vanessa started, her voice climbing toward panic. "Is it?" I said, and I let the question sit there, unanswered, because I didn't need to answer it. Everyone at that table could see the answer written across both their faces. Frank stepped forward then, unhurried, and opened the leather folder. "For anyone who'd like to see the forensic signature analysis," he said, in the mild, unbothered tone of a man who has delivered bad news in courtrooms for 30 years, "I have copies. I've also, as of this afternoon, filed a report with the district attorney's office regarding the forged notarization, and a separate motion with the county to void the fraudulent power of attorney and freeze the pending sale." My father set down his fork very slowly and looked at Daniel with an expression I had never once seen him wear in my entire life. Not anger, exactly, but the cold, total withdrawal of a man deciding, in real time, who was and was not still welcome at his table. "Get out of my house," he said, quietly, which was somehow worse than shouting. Daniel looked around the table at my father's face, at my aunts, at the 18 guests who were no longer pretending not to watch, and for a moment I saw something almost like calculation cross his features, a last attempt to find an angle that still worked. There wasn't one. There was nothing left to calculate with. "This is my wife's family too," he said, weakly, to no one in particular. "Not anymore," I said. "You forged my name to sell the one thing my mother ever left me. You don't get to keep the family you tried to steal from along with it." The room stayed silent after that. Not the pressurized, storm before it breaks silence I'd felt alone in that kitchen. Something else. The silence of a scale finally coming level. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected, the way water moves faster once a dam finally gives. Daniel's business partner, informed by his own attorney of the fraud investigation now underway, dissolved the LLC and severed ties within days, taking with him the last of the clients, whose retainer fees had apparently been propping up Daniel's cash flow for over a year. His business folded entirely by November. The district attorney's office, moving with the particular efficiency reserved for cases with clean forensic evidence and a cooperative victim, charged him with forgery and fraudulent notarization by February. He pled to a lesser count rather than risk trial, and the judge, unmoved by his attorney's argument about marital misunderstanding, ordered restitution and 18 months of probation. Vanessa's husband, a quiet, patient man named Mark who I'd always liked and never fully understood how she'd managed to keep, filed for divorce the week after that dinner. I heard, secondhand, through our Aunt Carol, that Vanessa moved into a studio apartment above the boutique, the same one that had never quite broken even, and that she was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely on her own. He took away the house I got from my grandmother. He lost far more than that in return. There is a particular kind of justice in that I don't think I could have engineered even if I'd tried. It found its own shape. I filed for divorce in October. It was faster than I expected. In the end, the forensic evidence made most of his objections evaporate before they could be raised, and the house, which had been purchased jointly but paid for mostly by me, came back to me without much of a fight, because a man who has just pled to forgery does not have much room left to argue about anything else. The cabin was saved in the end. Frank's motion to void the power of attorney went through cleanly. The fraudulent mortgage was discharged along with it once the bank confirmed the notarization was invalid, and by the following spring the deed sat, clean and unencumbered, exactly where it always should have been. In my name, only mine. 10 months after that dinner, I drove up to the cabin alone for the first weekend of summer, windows down the whole way past the last gas station on Route 9, gravel crunching under the tires in a way that had sounded, for most of my adult life, like the sound of arriving somewhere safe. The dock needed new boards again, same as every spring. I noticed the cedar siding had gone even more silver over the winter, weathered soft and gray the way it always did, and I stood on the porch for a long moment before I went inside, just looking at the lake, letting the quiet settle into my chest the way it used to when I was young enough to believe quiet was something you could keep forever if you were careful with it. I took the brass key out of my pocket, the same plain, undecorated key that had sat in the dish by our old front door for 2 years, that I'd carried in my coat pocket for the 10 weeks the fraud case was open like a talisman I couldn't quite explain to anyone, including myself, and I fitted into the lock, and I turned it, and the door opened the way it always had, smooth on hinges Daniel had once oiled on a Saturday afternoon I barely remembered anymore. I thought, standing there, of my mother's note, still clipped to the deed in a fireproof box back home. Asterisk for the only one of my daughters who ever actually wanted to be there. Asterisk she'd meant it as a description of love, I think, when she wrote it. A simple, unguarded fact about which daughter had always chased fireflies off that dock at dusk, and which one had always found reasons to leave early. She could not have known, writing it, that it would end up meaning something closer to a prophecy. That the cabin would become the exact thing two people who claimed to love me tried hardest to take, and the exact thing that, in the end, I fought hardest to keep. Frank drove up 2 weekends later with his fishing rod and the same bag of peppermints he'd always carried, and we sat on the dock with our feet in water that was still too cold for June, not talking much. The way old friends don't need to fill silence just to prove it's comfortable. "You look different," he said eventually. "Lighter." "I feel lighter," I said, and I did. Not healed exactly, that word implied a finish line I hadn't reached and maybe never fully would, but lighter. Unburdened of a weight I hadn't fully clocked I was carrying until it was gone. I made coffee that evening the way I always had, measuring by eye, no scoop, and I sat on the porch steps and drank it slowly while the lake turned the color of the sky above it, pink fading into that deep, particular blue that only shows up over water at dusk. For the first time in longer than I could easily remember, the coffee didn't taste bitter. It tasted simply like coffee, like something ordinary and good, made in a kitchen that finally, entirely belonged to me. The key sat on the counter behind me, catching the last of the light. I hadn't put it back in a dish by any door. I'd started wearing it on my own keyring instead, next to my car key and the key to the house I'd kept, small and brass and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its story. Some keys open doors. This one, I'd come to understand, had spent most of its life meaning something closer to home. It had taken almost losing it, almost watching it disappear into someone else's hands, someone else's scheme, to understand that the two things had never actually been different. I finished my coffee. The lake went dark. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence around me didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I'd finally, fully earned.